How important was Theodore Roosevelt to the development of martial arts in America? Hey everybody, I'm Jeff Shaw. I'm a professor at Western Washington University. I'm teaching a class on the history of martial arts, and whatever you answered about how influential Roosevelt was, the answer is almost definitely more influential than you think. But let me start my own answer with a story. When Robert Johnstone Mooney visited the White House in August 1904 with his brother, William McKinley Mooney, it wasn't a typical tourist visit. William McKinley Mooney was a noted amateur boxer, and the president wanted to spar with him. When Jiu-Jitsu and Judo arrived in America at the beginning of the 20th century, they found an audience, first with people who were looking for self-defense training, and then later with people who were looking to get into physical fitness or a window into another culture through public entertainment. Over the past 125 years, martial arts have helped transform American culture. What we watch, how we spend our time, how we train our bodies. And in 1993, Jiu-Jitsu in particular helped launch the Ultimate Fighting Championship, which created the multi-billion-dollar mixed martial arts revolution in America. President Roosevelt's public practice of jiu-jitsu and judo at the start of the last century helped contribute to all of that transformation, ultimately making jiu-jitsu an important part of American culture today. For this video, we're going to focus on the how of how important he was, rather than the why of why he was so important and how that helped jiu-jitsu to maintain a presence in America. We'll get into those in future videos. Even though Roosevelt is one of America's most influential and well-respected presidents, the role of the martial arts in his public and private life and in America's cultural evolution has been largely unexamined by academic scholars. I think that you can draw a line from Theodore Roosevelt to today's martial arts landscape, where millions of people train and tens of millions of people that don't even train watch martial arts for entertainment. I wanted to understand this better, and so I did a series of studies where I looked at the Library of Congress's Chronicling America database of local newspapers from 1900, when the first jiu-jitsu instructor arrived, until 1906, when the first wave of jiu-jitsu and judo instructors left America. I read all the articles that referenced jiu-jitsu or judo from 1900 to 1906 in that database, which was about 2,400 articles. As you might imagine, this media coverage both reflected and contributed to the growing popularity of the martial arts in America. So how influential was Roosevelt in that, you might ask? Well, here are a couple of numbers for you. Of those almost 2,400 articles, about 730 of them reference Roosevelt. That's about 30% of all coverage referencing the president, which already hints about the influence of Roosevelt in popularizing the martial art. But there's more. John O'Brien, who we've already talked about in previous videos, was America's first jiu-jitsu instructor and taught Roosevelt in 1902. He tried to make a splash in the media, but in each of the first 2 years he was in America, only a handful of stories about it were published, less than 10 in 1900 and 1902. After Roosevelt started training in 1902, coverage more than doubled in 1902 and 1903 and went up even higher in 1904. That was when Roosevelt started training with the legendary Kodokan judoka Yoshiaki Yamashita. It wasn't just about the numbers, though. Jiu-jitsu performances and challenge matches became regularly found in sports sections. Cartoons and even poems about jiu-jitsu made the front pages of newspapers all across America, and all of this helped socialize knowledge of the art, which press reports started describing as a fad or a craze as early as 1903. And Roosevelt was a huge part of this through stories like this one, where he was seen as endorsing jiu-jitsu. The New York Sun reported that just as horseback riding had increased in popularity after the president started taking up that as a hobby, so jiu-jitsu, under his influence, has become a popular fad in Washington. Certainly, Roosevelt was a famous and prominent person, and don't worry, we'll talk more about this comic in just a second. But let's take a step back and think about today how fired up the martial arts community gets when a famous person takes up a martial art, like Tom Hardy training jiu-jitsu or Idris Elba taking up Muay Thai. Or think about how fired up we get every time a mainstream media outlet talks about the UFC, or talks about jiu-jitsu, or talks about judo or Muay Thai. Now, imagine I can predict that next year, 2026, 1,500 articles are going to be written in the mainstream press. We're talking about prominent newspapers like the Washington Post, the New York Sun, things like that. If I were to tell you those outlets are going to write about jiu-jitsu 1,500 times next year, you would probably be pretty excited. You'd think jiu-jitsu had hit the mainstream, and you'd be right. Except that already happened, and it happened in 1905 when the population of the United States was less than 1/4 what it was today. So not only was Roosevelt influential in getting wealthy and powerful elite people in the economic and political centers of America to train, he also helped expose the general public throughout the country to jiu-jitsu as well. Even more than just reading about jujitsu, the public understood what it was, or at least they understood it enough for the term jujitsu to be used as an explanatory example in stories about completely different topics that had nothing to do with the martial arts. By 1905, we start to see jujitsu as a metaphor for various things, including in this cartoon from Walter Blackman of the Birmingham Age Herald, using jujitsu as a metaphor for Japan's strength to defeat Russia in the Russo-Japanese War while the world watches, taking notes. We also see jiu-jitsu used as a metaphor for Roosevelt's strength and political acumen, like this cartoon from Elmer Andrews Bushnell, where he's strong-arming the railroad trusts in order to get his way. It expands beyond Roosevelt, though, and it's not just in the national news. We start to see jiu-jitsu used as a metaphor in the Washington and New York papers, of course, but also from Alabama's Age Herald, the Fairmont West Virginian, and the Jefferson, Texas Jimblecute. Local newspapers from all around the country are using jiu-jitsu as a metaphor. The metaphor would be applied to the president in terms of international diplomacy with Venezuela, with Russia, with Japan, in terms of finding the essential nerve of the voter in order to win elections last November, and most commonly in his fight against the railroad trust, like from the cartoon before, where he said that they dominated markets and exploited consumers, and we used jiu-jitsu as a metaphor for Roosevelt's fight against that. The fact that this was happening consistently and in a wide range of geographies all across America shows that writers and editors across the country had confidence the average reader was familiar with jiu-jitsu, and was familiar enough that they would understand the use of the martial art as a metaphor. That fight against railroad trusts was a multi-year battle, and sometimes the images would use varying degrees of violent imagery, like this gentle foot sweep that we see Roosevelt doing on a locomotive. And you can compare that to the more assertive use of jiu-jitsu here, where Roosevelt's depicted beating up the railroad baron Edward Harriman. As the art grew in prominence, the view of what jiu-jitsu was expanded. At first, it was just a tool for self-defense, but then suddenly you see it as a sport you could play, as something you could watch to entertain yourself, as a fitness tool that you could use to stay in shape. That's one of the subjects of this paper I just presented to the World Conference on Social Sciences at Cambridge University. We've talked in this video about how influential Roosevelt was, and the paper gets into sort of the why of why that happened. I'll publish a link when it's out. For now, just know that the president wasn't exaggerating when he talked to the Mooney brothers. When Robert and William Mooney visited the White House in 1904 to do some boxing sparring with the president, they almost certainly did not expect to be introduced to a Japanese martial art. But neither did anybody else in the country, and as the president told Robert Johnstone Mooney in this article, Roosevelt practically introduced it to Americans. This might seem like a boast, but it's not an exaggeration. No single person did more to introduce jiu-jitsu and judo to America than President Theodore Roosevelt.